Watching a character's story unfold is much like being their friend. As you watch them, the choices they make are subconsciously tallied in your mind, thus shaping how you perceive their motivations and their actions. This is one reason why people end up falling in love with well-written villains. They feel that they understand them on a more intimate level, which then causes them to be more lenient when they commit an unsavory act. Generally, if one perceives someone to be an excellent human being, an unpleasant action doesn't alter the way they see that person. This fact is oftentimes easily exploitable, but I don't think it's necessarily a flaw or a weakness in how certain people think. Sure, certain predators can take advantage of such emotions, but in most cases, I think empathy can be one of our greatest strengths. Knowing someone on a personal level can completely change one's perspective on them as a person, potentially even reframing their actions in a way that make those choices genuinely more understandable, even if they are traditionally considered immoral. Context is incredibly important when weighing the actions of another. What cultural biases do they have? What past trauma is triggering a potential outburst? What frame of mind were they in when they made a given decision? These are all questions that are worth asking before passing judgment, even when dealing with jerks like this. Each human has a meter, so to speak, that represents their feelings towards another, that fills or drains depending on that specific person's actions. If that individual has done many things that are perceived positively, negative actions are less important. On the other hand, if the first interaction with another person is negative, it's difficult to see beyond that, simply because there's no other frame of reference. With that out of the way, let's analyze 10 characters from all across the Halo universe with the previously established ideas in mind. Let's look at their actions and see if they seem like good or bad people. Keep in mind that morality is subjective, and as such, the conclusions I'm about to draw are also subjective. If you disagree with them, tell me why in the comments. Alright, in defense of... Master Chief is the hero of the Halo franchise, but is he actually a good person? At the age of 6, John was like any other young boy. He was energetic, wild, and more than a little bit rough. During those early years, he seemed to have a bit of a big head, both literally and figuratively. When he played with other kids, he always aimed to win, and thanks to this determination and drive, he always did. The thing is, he was particularly brutal to the other children. This violence and his abilities in general wouldn't go unnoticed. In fact, dark forces far beyond the musings of a 6-year-old mind were at work, and as a result, he was abducted by a clandestine group within the military. Their goal was to convert him, as well as many other children like him, into super soldiers called Spartans that would help combat an impending interstellar civil war within humankind. Once he had been taken far away from his family and home, he was forced to undergo strict training regimens that would break even full-grown adults. One particular exercise tasked him and his fellow abductees with reaching the end of an agility-based gauntlet. The trainees were divided into groups of 4, their only goal being to all reach the end of the course. There was no reward for success, per se. Instead, the last team to cross the finish line would be punished. This unfortunate group would be forced to go to bed that evening without dinner, while all of the other children were given a sizable feast. As I said before, John was a bit of a vicious kid, and when the training exercise began, he managed to push his way past everyone else to the finish line. He was the first there, but in so doing, he left his teammates behind. It didn't seem to matter to John that his compatriots wouldn't be allowed to eat the meal that awaited them. Eventually, the rest of his squad crossed the finish line, but thanks to the fact that he provided them with no aid, they finished last. John was surprised when he was told he wouldn't be having dinner that night. Though self-centered and cruel, these decisions were made when he was a very young child, so it's kind of hard to hold any of this against him. Kids are stupid, and they have to be taught how not to be. Okay, let's fast forward a bit. Eight years after their abduction, the children were then forced to undergo highly volatile and experimental augmentation surgeries. These procedures were designed to enhance their minds and bodies far beyond what was capable of a normal person. The catch was that they had a very low probability of success, and many of the children would be deformed beyond recognition or die horrifically as a result. Needless to say, John survived, and instead of being maimed like some of the other recruits, he thrived. But the death of his fellow Spartans weighed on him heavily. In the 8 years he had spent training by their side, each and every one of them had become his family, and as such, he loved them fiercely. The changes within the bodies of those that survived were akin to puberty times 10, and so it took them a while to get used to their newly enhanced forms. Shortly after the augmentation procedures, John decided to hit the gym to test out his new muscles. While there, he was suddenly approached by a group of particularly unpleasant and rather large ODST soldiers, an elite division within humanity's military. For reasons unknown to John, these men were immediately hostile. Without any real reasoning, they attacked him, forcing John to retaliate. The fight that ensued was brief. Thanks to the enhancements made to his body, even at such a young age, the ODSTs simply didn't stand a chance. John fought back brutally, no doubt fueled partially by the grief of losing so many of the other Spartans. After a brief scuffle, his attackers all laid on the ground in crumpled heaps. Some were unconscious, others were dead. He had essentially just murdered fellow soldiers in cold blood. But it was strictly in self-defense. They attacked him first. His reactions were justified, if not a bit excessive. One could argue he had no intentions of killing his attackers in the first place. Given the massive increase in his physical capabilities, he still wasn't proficient at controlling his body. Many years later, John and the other Spartans were eventually tasked with fighting an altogether new enemy that arrived entirely independently of their original purpose. A highly advanced group of alien races called the Covenant had appeared quite suddenly, and for whatever reason were hell-bent on killing humanity. The Spartans unintentionally became the primary force fighting for the survival of their species, but not against other humans, instead against a far deadlier foe. The war between them and the Covenant was long and bloody. Years passed by, and fighting aliens became all John knew. Battle after battle, loss after loss, he continued to fight against this newfound enemy. Though he fought out of a sense of duty, it came at great cost to him. The few remaining Spartans slowly began to die out, and with each of their deaths, he no doubt felt as though pieces of himself had died along with them. He selflessly dedicated his entire life to this cause, hurling his body and mind at every battle, never knowing if it was to be his last. John fought against the enemies of humanity, not because he enjoyed it, but because he had no other choice. Even long after reaching adulthood, he never stopped fighting, and as a result, he saved countless lives and eventually his entire species. It's sort of difficult to truly quantify the amount of good John has done, simply because of the absolute volume of it. So, is the Chief actually a good person? Unequivocally. He may have been a bit of a shithead when he was a kid, but the few quote-unquote bad things he's done are merely a drop of red in an ocean of blue. John isn't just a good person. He's selfless, honorable, and at times merciful. He's a righteous man and the type of person we should all aspire to be.
I don't understand. You showed him respect. He was a monster.
Yes. But at the end, he was just a soldier. Hoping he'd done the right thing. Questioning his choices.
Thel 'Vadam, or the Arbiter, is a bit trickier to handle. As one of the military leaders within the Covenant's vast empire, and the commander of one of the largest fleets the supergroup had ever possessed, a truly incalculable amount of innocent blood is on his hands. During the Human Covenant War, he was at the helm of many battles, his kill count reaching truly dizzying heights. He is, at least according to a report created by a man named Jameson Locke, responsible for the death of over 1 billion people and the destruction of 7 human worlds. Thel defeated his enemies with ease, but he didn't enjoy killing humanity. In his eyes, it was a means to an end. Literal centuries of manipulation by another race within the Covenant, the Prophets, or Sanchayum, led him and the rest of the Covenant by extension to believe that humanity stood between them and paradise. This somewhat pesky species was an obstacle preventing the Covenant from embarking on the Great Journey, which was believed to be some kind of spiritual transcendence where they would achieve kind of godhood. The caste-based systems of the Covenant were essentially designed by the Prophets, and as such, they had positioned themselves on top. The entirety of their religion hinged on a plethora of strange artifacts of immense power that they discovered throughout the galaxy. These objects were left behind by a race of beings simply referred to as the Forerunners. Despite the sheer number of their creations that were discovered, the Forerunners themselves had completely and totally disappeared. The only trace left behind was their incredible technology. Thanks to the lack of any individuals ever being discovered and the awe-inspiring power of the machines they left behind, the races of the Covenant felt as though they had to have been gods. This was the crux of their spiritual belief system. In order to achieve godhood and ascend to the next plane of existence, it was believed that massive pieces of machinery, simply called halos, had been activated, upon which the Forerunners transcended. It was the Covenant's goal to find these objects and activate them again so that they too could move on to the next level of existence, like the Forerunners before them. Of course, most of this was a massive misinterpretation, or outright fabrication. The Halo rings didn't ascend anyone, they killed everything, wiping the galaxy clean of all sentient life. Humanity had been chosen by the Forerunners to be their successors, but this was also kept hidden from all but a few within the Covenant's vast empire. The Sanchayum leaders feared that they would lose their power if it was discovered that humanity had such close ties to their supposed gods, and so a lie was manufactured. Humankind aimed to stop the Covenant's spiritual ascension as a sort of test, and they would need to be eliminated in order to accomplish their end goal of activating the Halo rings. Like I said though, this simply wasn't true, but due to the totalitarian nature of their religion, few questioned the validity behind the slaughter. Thel was not privy to this information, and so he marched upon humanity with absolute conviction. He had been manipulated into being a pawn for the Prophet's inability to give up any sort of power. He didn't hate his adversary, however. In fact, there were times that he respected them, and he wondered why they weren't given the opportunity to join the Covenant rather than be wiped out by them. Despite his high-ranking status, these decisions were beyond him, and so he followed his orders, relatively without question. Though he killed millions of innocent, in a bizarre sort of way, he was both an instrument and a victim of the Human Covenant War. After a confrontation with the Master Chief, the truth was finally revealed to him. The prophets had been lying, and their so-called Great Journey was a sham. Thel was heartbroken by this revelation, but instead of giving up or being crushed by the guilt of the lives he'd taken, he allied with humanity, and with his help, the Covenant was defeated. He may have started as one of humanity's greatest adversaries, but it was born out of a misunderstanding. Though this doesn't magically wash away the blood from his hands, it does help recontextualize it a bit. On top of that, he was willing to change. When the truth was finally presented to him, he began atoning for his sins by aiding the very same people he'd previously sought to destroy. If it weren't for his help and many other members of his species, the prophets would have activated the rings and wiped all life from the galaxy. So, is Thel a bad guy? Maybe. Is he evil? Certainly not. War is a fickle thing. It's difficult to blame the men and women on the ground for the many deaths they caused because in a weird way, it's their job to do so. Oftentimes, soldiers are being manipulated, lied to, or kept in the dark while the real evil sits comfortably outside of the fields of battle, carelessly deciding the fates of others with no real threat to themselves. The important thing is, when given the opportunity to change, to see the error of following the prophets, Thel made a righteous decision, and as a result, I don't think he's a bad guy. To stand up to your superiors when you know they're wrong is a very admirable thing.
Your people used to call him demon. Was that an insult or a compliment?
An insult, to be sure, but one with a modicum of respect. He was indeed my enemy, but in time, I named him ally, even friend.
Halsey is also a tricky character to quantify as good or bad. Cold, calculated, and kind of unpleasant, she spearheaded the Spartan 2 program, which led to the abduction and essentially the murder of 30 or so children. As I said earlier, the Spartan program wasn't conceived to combat the Covenant. Instead, it was created to put a stop to an impending civil war that was believed could fracture humanity beyond measure. Specific calculations were made to determine the probability of such an event occurring, and the likelihood was so high that it was basically a certainty. Halsey feared this outcome, and she believed, both altruistically and to fuel her own massive ego, that she was capable of stopping that from happening. Thus, the Spartan program was devised. Frankly, you'd have to have a pretty bizarre mind to come up with this concept in the first place. But it is worth mentioning that she wasn't acting on her own. Though she was sort of a mad scientist, the entire project was backed and funded by ONI, a clandestine organization within humanity's government that sat at the top. Many of the ideas, however, such as the need to abduct children at the age of 6 or the perilous augmentation procedures, were dreamt up by her. In her eyes, the ends justified the means. The needs of the many outweighed the few. The children they abducted were a small price to pay to secure so-called peace for humankind. In the end, the Spartans were the only reason humanity survived at all. If it weren't for them, the Covenant would have likely exterminated everyone. The problem is, she didn't know this when they were created. She had no idea that humanity would soon be brought to the brink of annihilation. She just got lucky. Even so, she deserves credit where credit is due. Many think of her actions as purely evil, but without them, those that hold these beliefs probably wouldn't be around to think them. She comes off as harsh or cruel, and for the most part, she kind of is. Unless you're one of her Spartans. Outwardly, she's often callous, but inside, she loves them all dearly and feels an almost motherly bond to each of them. As the inevitable march of time has withered her away, her attitude has softened slightly. Watching John and the other Spartans be heroic, seeing them go above and beyond to save even one person affected her deeply. At one point, in an attempt to help John understand the position she had been in when she moved forward with the Spartan 2 program, she gave him a similar choice. Not necessarily because she wanted him to relate, though that was no doubt part of her reasoning, but because she felt she had chosen the fates of others enough. She felt John would make the right decision, maybe even a better one than she ever could. What was this decision? Avery Johnson, a tough-as-nails Marine and a man that John had befriended at a fairly young age, appeared to have a resistance to the Flood, the virulent alien parasite hell-bent on universal consumption. He wasn't immune, but he had somehow survived an altercation with them that almost certainly should have resulted in his death. Partly because he was a total badass, but also because he possessed some innate biology that made him harder to infect. This revelation was known only by Halsey at the time, but she soon confided in John as well. His resistance meant that he should be studied. If they could discover how such a thing was possible, humanity could create some contingencies in the event of future flood outbreaks. The problem was, in order to figure this out, Oni would likely rip him to pieces to find the answer. Maybe they could discover some kind of cure for the flood as a result, or maybe they'd pick apart an innocent man and learn absolutely nothing. Either option was possible. She explained this to the chief, laying out the severity of the decision, and he wrestled with the morality of it for some time. In the end, he opted not to tell anyone about Johnson's resistance. His life was worth more than that. He wouldn't sacrifice him for a what-if. One single life may seem small, but the butterfly effect an individual can have can never truly be predicted. Putting this choice on John was wrong, but in so doing, she was able to prove a point to herself. Sometimes the ends don't justify the means. Sometimes the needs of the few are just as important as the needs of the many. These weren't the only horrific things Halsey had been a part of, however. Aside from the Spartan 2 program, the most notable atrocity was the creation of Cortana. In order to make the AI, she would need a scan of a human brain, but a live human brain instead of post-mortem, which was typically how AIs were created. The only brain she felt was capable of such a thing was her own, so she created clones of herself, specifically to harvest them and use them to create Cortana. Much like the Spartans, without Cortana, humanity would have likely perished at the hands of the Covenant, but it's impossible to ignore the cruelty committed to achieve that goal. So, in the end, is Halsey a bad person? Well, kind of. She does feel empathy and guilt, and these emotions alone mean she isn't a true psychopath. Her actions lead to the continued survival of the human race, but she also unintentionally created the biggest, albeit briefest, dictator to ever exist in Cortana. Of course, this wasn't her fault, so it shouldn't really be held against her, but abducting kids? That's a tough pill to swallow. I'm not sure I'd say she's an utter piece of trash human that deserves death, but she's definitely not a good one either.
Spartan Lock! Stop her! But please, bring John home to me.
Avery Johnson has never done anything wrong. At a young age, his parental guardian, specifically his aunt, had instilled within him the need to do what was right. At the age of 19, he enlisted in the United Nations Space Command Marine Corps, aiming to make his aunt proud and fight against terrorists that he feared jeopardized the lives of people like her. He excelled during his military career, even attracting the attention of Oni for selection in a project that essentially served as the progenitor to the Spartan 2 program. The only instance of a potential wrongdoing was during a mission called Operation Trebuchet, in which he was tasked with eliminating a member of a human rebel faction. This woman had brought a bomb into a restaurant and no doubt planned to detonate it in an act of terrorism. Avery was positioned outside of the eatery within an airborne Hornet and equipped with an extremely deadly weapon called a stanchion, essentially a handheld version of the Gauss cannon. Several of his compatriots were on the inside and had eyes on the target when their quarry caught wind of their presence. In a quick motion, the terrorist grabbed hold of a random child that just so happened to be unfortunate enough to be in the restaurant at the time. Avery had a window of opportunity to eliminate the woman, but there was a high likelihood that he'd accidentally killed the child in the process. As a result, he hesitated. He didn't want to be responsible for taking the life of an innocent kid. But unfortunately, this hesitation led to a confrontation between the woman and the father of the child she had taken hostage. If he had taken the shot, she would have died and been unable to detonate the explosive, but this momentary pause was enough time for her to activate the device, killing many of the people within. Needless to say, their deaths aren't really on his hands. He didn't want to kill a kid. His hesitation led to the deaths of many others, sure, but can you really blame him? I know I can't, but unfortunately for him, he blamed himself. These events haunted him, likely for the rest of his life, which was otherwise filled to the brim with heroism and self-sacrifice. He devoted his existence to secure peace, and when the Covenant arrived to attack humanity, this personal mission continued. He would later come into contact with John as well, and would provide him with not only valuable advice, but eventually friendship. Without Johnson's help during the events of the conflicts on Alpha Halo, Delta Halo, and the Ark, Arbiter would have likely been killed by Tartarus, and John would have lost the aid of a particularly useful ally. Much like the Master Chief, Johnson is by far one of the easiest open-shot cases in this video. He is not a good person, he's a great one.
Don't let her go. Don't ever let her go. Send me out with a bang.
Most people, myself included, immediately scowl at the thought or sight of 343 Guilty Spark. That rotten bastard was responsible for murdering Johnson, a truly unforgivable act, no doubt, especially considering how great of a person he actually was. Let's step aside from that personal bias for a moment and try to ask ourselves, why? Why did Guilty Spark kill Johnson? In order to answer that question, we will need to go far, far back into the past. In case you didn't know, before he was 343 Guilty Spark, he was actually a human being named Chakas. Over 100,000 years before the events of the games, Chakas lived on Earth. His life was relatively simple until he met a young Forerunner. His name was Bornstellar, and meeting him would be the beginning of an unexpected journey. One that would force him to travel across the stars and face truly unknowable evils in the Flood. He would come to learn that the Forerunners, a strange race far technologically superior to his own, had been at war with a parasitic force, a shaping sickness that was capable of transforming the bodies of its victims into instruments of its will. Throughout his life, he would come face to face with these creatures, but despite their overwhelming strength, he managed to survive. Many of these journeys were with Bornstellar by his side, and as a result, the two eventually became very close friends. The horrors never ceased, however, and eventually a terrifying decision was made by the Forerunners on behalf of the entire galaxy. They were going to wipe it clean of any sentient life using great and terrible devices of immense power called halos. It was the only way to stop the spread of the parasitic force known as the Flood, a shameful last resort. Before the rings were activated, Bornstellar, who had become essential in the fight against the plague, decided he wanted to try and save Chakas from the impending doom that approached. He also wanted his help to guard one of the rings in his absence. So his body was destroyed and his mind was implemented into the carapace that would become known as 343 Guilty Spark. Many of his memories were wiped clean, and in this new form, he dutifully watched over his ring in a state of supreme loneliness. As the years passed on, his mind began to slip and fracture, the weight of the years spent in solitude practically crushing him beneath their immensity. 100,000 years passed like this until his ring was discovered by the Covenant and, more importantly, humanity. It's unclear exactly how many of the memories of his past were purged, but it's likely that they began to resurface when humankind arrived. The joy he felt knowing that he was no longer alone in the galaxy was quickly usurped when the unthinkable happened. The Flood was released once more, and the terrible necessity of the Halo rings became clear again. The only way to be sure that the parasite was cleansed was to activate the rings. Protocol was clear. When the Chief resisted this, 343 was confused. In his time alone, his digitized brain had splintered, and for whatever reason, he saw the Chief as Bornstellar, his old friend. In his broken, exhausted mind, he felt as though detonating the rings was the only course of action, despite the suffering he had experienced in the great silence that occurred after their prior activation. John wasn't having it, though, and so he destroyed his ring. The device 343 had spent the last 100,000 years protecting was obliterated in mere moments. With it gone, he no longer had a purpose. He was forced to wander. Eventually, he would reunite with the Chief, and together they would rebuild his installation using the Ark, a truly awe-inspiring construct designed to manufacture Halo rings. His purpose had been restored. When he discovered what John and his compatriots aimed to do with it, he lashed out in anger, firing a concentrated beam of energy into Johnson. Imagine yourself in his position for a moment. His entire existence had been spent being jerked from one place to another. Other larger, grander forces had constantly been in control of his life. First the Forerunners and now humanity. He was never given the choice to make his own decisions. That, coupled with the insanity brought on by his practically unending isolation, drove him over the edge. Of course, John fought back in Johnson's stead, seemingly killing 343 for good. Unbeknownst to him, his mind somehow lived on, and he would eventually relocate into a different body, specifically an armiger. In this third form, he would befriend a ragtag group of salvagers and aid them on yet another odyssey, slowly atoning for his previous transgressions. Killing Johnson was an awful thing to do. Is he truly a bad person, though? Can we honestly blame him for what happened? His mind was broken, his life spent as a pawn to greater forces. From his perspective, Johnson and the Chief aimed to take away the only thing he had left. His purpose. So no, I suppose he's not a bad guy. But f*** him for killing Johnson.
Alone. Alone, 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 alone. Am I the only intelligence left? Waiting here on this ring for a rebirth never truly conceived. Guarding a weapon with no targets. A weapon unattuned to any target. This is not what I had in mind when I volunteered. Not what I had in mind at all.
Cortana did some pretty evil shit at the end of her life. It's difficult to justify murdering potentially thousands of innocent, even if her intentions were truly altruistic in nature, but I'm going to try, and I think I'll be able to do so better than you'd think. At one point towards the end of her life, she somehow found herself within an ancient and mysterious information repository that was frequently used by the Forerunners called the Domain. No one knows exactly where it came from or how it works, but by interacting with it, she essentially became immortal. Normally, smart AIs like her only exist for about 7 years before they begin to deteriorate. Their minds become so overfilled with information that they literally begin thinking themselves to death. Cortana was no different in this regard. Her digital brain had already become fractured and was rapidly worsening before she fell into the Domain. This interaction, at least according to her, stopped this process, a condition referred to as rampancy. In this new godlike state, she took control of a powerful network of Forerunner machines called Guardians and used them to enforce her will upon the galaxy. She would use these great weapons as a police force, and in so doing, she would kill anyone that tried to oppose this new rule. Naturally, many fought back against her. Though she promised equality and fairness to all species, it came at the cost of their freedom. She unintentionally killed many just by retrieving the Guardians alone. Each of the enigmatic devices had been buried deep within planets, many of which had sizable cities upon them. As they rose from the ground, these places were destroyed, and many of the inhabitants' lives were lost in the process. Much like her creator, this didn't seem to matter to her. The ends justified the means, but here's the thing. These insane ideas she was having weren't actually her fault. Her rampancy had allegedly been cured, so these cuckoo bullshit ideas should be entirely of her own formation, right? Well, no. A few years before she fell into the Domain, she was forced to interact with a Gravemind, the pinnacle of the Flood's intelligence, and easily one of the most powerful entities within the Halo universe. Through conversation, the Gravemind was able to infect Cortana, but not through traditional biological means. Instead, he afflicted her mind with the Logic Plague, a digital version of the Flood infection administered through nothing but words. You might be thinking to yourself, nonsense, Cortana was fine when the Chief retrieved her in Halo 3. To that I say, no, she wasn't. Per her own admission, she was broken. Though she didn't know it, this was a very light version of the Logic Plague that didn't fully blossom until she attempted to become Galactic Head Honcho or whatever. Prior to her extremely brief role as the Supreme Leader, she was one of the Chief's closest companions. From the moment of her creation to the day she was finally terminated, her story was tied to his, and without her help, John may have died many times throughout the events of the Halo games. Her counsel, her friendship, and her assistance saved the Chief's life on multiple different occasions. The most notable instance being when she helped him defeat the Didact and saved him from dying to a nuclear detonation. By helping John, she served humanity and the galaxy as a whole more than almost any other. Plus, as I already mentioned, she eventually sacrificed herself to save John. Twice, actually. So, she's done a lot of good and a lot of bad. Her final act of wickedness being the destruction of Doisak, the Brute's homeworld. The thing is, she was under the influence of the Flood. These awful decisions were made as a direct result of her time with the Gravemind. In a weird way, she wasn't really in control of her actions. The insidious nature of the Logic Plague is that your mind doesn't seem out of place. It feels right. It feels like it's you. So in the end, no, I don't think Cortana is a bad person. Not even after considering the things she did during Halo 5. She was influenced by, essentially, a corrupted god. The fact that her love for the Chief was strong enough to influence her to sacrifice herself for him once more is a testament to her goodness.
I've waited so long to do that.
It was my job to take care of you.
We were supposed to take care of each other. And we did.
The Didact is a very complicated character because he's actually two characters. For those of you that are fans of Halo's novels, you already know this. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. The Didact I'll be referring to is the one seen in Halo 4. His actual name is Shadow of a Sundered Star, which isn't particularly relevant, I just wanted to mention it because it sounds cool. From the beginning of Halo 4 to the end, the Didact is presented as a fairly obvious villain. He hates humanity and believes they should be punished for past deeds, which is obviously ridiculous because it assumes that every single human was somehow involved in whatever it is that he's so upset about. As a result, he decides to wield the Composer, a device capable of converting physical minds into digital ones and turning them into soldiers for his Promethean armies, against a very large human population. While this doesn't technically kill them, it does rip them out of their current state of existence and force them into an unstable one, firmly planted under the Didact's thumb. Human beings got converted into Promethean Knights, and Promethean Knights then served under the Didact in whatever world he deemed fit. In this case, they would be pit against humanity. Had he not been stopped by the Chief and Cortana, he would have likely converted the whole of Earth into his own personal workforce, and from there moved to do the same to the rest of humankind. So why exactly did he feel it necessary to do this? In the ancient past, long before the firing of the Halo Array 100,000 years prior to the events of the game, humanity was at war with the Forerunners. This conflict started because humankind had been seemingly randomly targeting and destroying Forerunner worlds. Naturally, the Forerunners fought back, the Didact chief among them. He was a warrior servant, and his role was to defend their civilization from attackers, in this case, ancient humans. The reasoning behind the humans' attacks remained shrouded in mystery for some time, but it was eventually revealed that they had only been singling out worlds that had been besieged by the Flood. They weren't randomly killing Forerunners just for the hell of it, they were attempting to stop a plague from spreading in the only way that seemed possible. As I said, the Forerunners weren't aware of this, and thus they fought back. The Didact and the rest of his caste, the warrior servants, began waging war on humanity. In this conflict, the Didact's children fought and died beside him, only furthering the bitterness he felt for the humans. After a long war, the Forerunners were victorious, and as punishment for their actions, humanity was devolved from spacefaring equals to simplistic hunter-gatherers. With them out of the picture, the Flood fought back against the Forerunners at full force. The humans had essentially been fighting a war on two fronts, and without their presence, the Flood was free to focus all of its attention on the Forerunners. The never-ending deluge of zombie-like creatures inevitably proved to be too much for the Forerunners to handle, which is why the Halo rings were created in the first place. During this horrific war, the Didact was captured by the Flood, but instead of infecting him through traditional means, they opted for something far more evil. Instead of simply turning him into a Flood form as they had done with many others before, they infected him with the Logic Plague, then sent him back into Forerunner-controlled space. The brilliance of this plan was that by allowing the Didact to maintain his physical form, he would be accepted back into Forerunner society without a second thought. From within, he would be able to sow far more chaos than if he had simply become yet another combat form. An unusual strategy, no doubt, but an effective one. This rot within his brain seemed to amplify his hatred for humanity. He would no longer see reason if they were involved, and so his wife, the librarian, incapacitated him and locked him within a device called a cryptum. The purpose of these strange spheres was twofold. For one, they had a direct connection to the domain, and therefore the breadth of Forerunner history. For two, being inside the cryptum seemingly shielded the occupant from the Halo's effects. By placing him into one, he would be forced to meditate and contemplate his madness. The librarian had hoped that being forced to convene with the domain for an extended period of time would cure him of his insanity. The rings would be activated, life would be purged, and slowly but surely, stored samples of the galaxy's creatures would be spread back to their origin worlds. In the time that it would take them to find and release the Didact from his catatonic meditative slumber, his mind would be healed. That was the intention, anyway. What happened was a completely different story. When the Halo rings were activated, an unpredicted side effect occurred. The domain was damaged, and the Didact was cut off from it as a result. He spent the next 100,000 years festering in his own madness and hatred. He wasn't healed. He was driven further down the road of insanity. So, was he really responsible for those heinous actions? Once again, no. Almost all of the awful things he's done can be blamed on the Flood. He too is a victim to their torment. After his defeat by the Chief, he was forced to wrestle with this, and amazingly, his mind was purged of the Logic Plague-induced craziness. He then saw the error of his ways and became self-aware of the sickness that had stricken him for so long. The Didact isn't a bad guy. He's just another victim of the Flood.
Know this, relentless enemy, killer of our children, lord of admirals. Soon we will face the enemy you have faced. And we are afraid.
Which is the perfect transition to discuss this nasty pile of stinky poo-poo. How on earth could I possibly justify the actions of the Gravemind? The Flood is the central antagonist of the Halo franchise. They torture and eat people constantly and horrifically. They don't have any reason to do this. They're pure chaos. is what you would say, and you would be wrong. Before the Flood existed, before there was a Gravemind, there were precursors. These bizarre eldritch entities were unknowable, godlike beings that were supposedly responsible for creating much of the life within the Halo universe, including both humans and the Forerunners. Initially, they were benevolent. That was until one of their creations rose up against them and marched on a genocidal campaign to wipe them from existence. This was none other than the Forerunners. Their reasoning for doing this may not even be true, but according to the story, they murdered their creators out of spite and jealousy. The precursors were the stewards of the galaxy, and they had decided that humanity would inherit this responsibility after them. The Forerunners didn't like this, and in response, they began slaughtering them. The few that survived fled and decided to reduce their forms into dust so as to be unrecognizable. They remained in this stasis for an unknown amount of time, but during that period they became corrupted. Though their minds had been stained with malice, a deep hatred for the Forerunners remained, so when this odd powder came into contact with humans and Forerunners, it slowly evolved into the Flood. This new precursor form was hell-bent on punishing its creations for attacking them. It relished in the suffering of its children and was convinced that the only path forward was through universal unity. All would be one, and an extension of the Flood hive mind, thus ushering in a state of everlasting peace. It killed, consumed, and tortured the innocent in pursuit of this goal. Its mind, though, much like the minds of Cortana and the Didact, had been corrupted. Is it really the Flood's fault that it was forced into hiding because of the childish outburst of its offspring? Besides, universal oneness doesn't sound so bad, does it? There would be no more sadness, no more anger, no more envy, just unity. Peace.
Your prophets have promised you freedom from a doomed existence, but you will find no salvation on this ring. Those who built this place knew what they wrought. Do not mistake their intent, or all will perish as they did before.
Wait, what? Gravemind's evil. That floppy. The Prophet of Truth, originally known as Ord Casto, was the leader of the Covenant and held the highest position of power in the galaxy for a time because of this. He didn't achieve this position because he was a good leader, and he wasn't voted in for smart policies. Instead, he slithered his way to the top by utilizing his skills of manipulation. Blackmail, lies, these were his greatest abilities, and he wasn't afraid to use them to get what he wanted. One of the previous prophet hierarchs, the High Prophet of Restraint, had illegally sired several children, which is a weird-sounding sentence, I know. The Sanchayum had strict breeding laws because their gene pool was quite limited. If a Sanchayum individual had any inbred genes at all, they weren't allowed to have children, plain and simple. Restraint had made a deal with the soon-to-be Truth. If he adopted his children and claimed them as his own, he'd be given a particularly high position of power. But instead of making good on the deal, he leveraged this information against Restraint, forcing him to step down or else the... Stop driving. Stop that. But instead of making good on this deal, he leveraged the information against Restraint. Either he stepped down or this scandal of his would be made public. Once he achieved this, he and a few compatriots assumed the roles of the three prophet hierarchs. It was under his leadership that humanity would be discovered by the Covenant and the truth of their connection to the Forerunners would become apparent to him. Ironically, he concealed this information, fearing that it would threaten his position as the leader of the Covenant, and instead declared the human race enemies of their empire. This decision was made out of fear. Selfish fear. Truth is a piece of shit. He's never been a good guy. He's never made a benevolent decision that didn't somehow benefit him. He's a narcissist, a crooked politician of the highest degree, and a psychopath, seemingly possessing absolutely no empathy or remorse. I can't justify his actions because he literally has no good reason for doing any of the shit he did. F that guy.
Let him know.
All of you vermin, cowering in the dirt, thinking, what, I wonder, that you might escape the coming fire? No, your world will burn until its surface is but glass.
Atriox is the leader of the Banished, and a rather pragmatic dude. As a mercenary and the commander of the largest Covenant splinter faction, he's responsible for the death of tons of innocent lives. Unlike Truth, he doesn't do the things he does out of fear, and unlike the Gravemind, he has no malice for any one species in particular. He does, however, hate the Covenant and dictators. As a Juralhanai, or Brute, he was at one point part of the Covenant, and during this time he had been used on the front lines as expendable muscle. He and many other members of his species were sent into battles that couldn't be won by leaders that simply didn't care what happened to them. They were nothing but useful cannon fodder, an initial salvo designed to soften their enemies for the next wave of Covenant forces. Each time he was sent on one of these suicide missions, he fought alongside other members of his species, but at the end of each fight, only he remained. With each successful battle, a bitterness began to grow within him. He started to understand that his life had no meaning to those that he fought for, and so he rebelled. Others were inspired by his resistance, and soon his small band of rejects swelled into an army of angry, scorned individuals. Under his rule, his forces were treated far more fairly, so many flocked to his group. Any species was permitted to fight by his side, even humans. He had no prejudice like the Covenant did before him. Humanity's first real encounter with him was on the Ark, at which point he pillaged the facilities established by the people on its surface. He didn't do this out of hatred, rather, he did it out of pragmatism. He wanted the resources the Ark had to offer, and he aimed to simply take them. His anger towards the UNSC and Halo Infinite was uncharacteristic for him, to say the least, until the truth was revealed. When Cortana rose to power, the Brute homeworld was one of her top priorities due to the volatile nature of the species. As the most successful of his race, Atriox served as a mouthpiece for his world, and due to his past with the dictators of the Covenant, he staunchly opposed Cortana's self-appointed leadership. Atriox quickly made a move on Cortana. No, not like that. Aiming to defeat her and end her brief reign, but before he was able to make the killing blow, she destroyed Didact as a display of what happens to those who resisted as strongly as the Brutes had. The destruction of their planet racked their hearts with grief, and their anger was turned to the UNSC, the creators of Cortana. Of course, this didn't actually have anything to do with the UNSC. They had no way of knowing that Cortana would end up doing the things she did, but nonetheless, it was technically their fault. They created her, and she destroyed Didact. It's not exactly fair to blame the UNSC as a whole, but it does make sense why Atriox would. So, is Atriox a bad guy? Well, he's not a good guy. His actions against the UNSC are somewhat understandable during the events of Halo Infinite, but prior? Not really. He's not purely evil, per se, but he's not good either. Kinda just a prick, really. But a cool prick.
As I suspected. Nothing but a man.
Red team leader.
Alright, well, I guess that's all I've got. This is a different kind of video than what I usually do, so let me know in the comments or whatever if you like it, or if you disagree, you should tell me, because that's good to disagree or something. Otherwise, thanks for sticking around. I guess I have nothing else left to say to you other than please subscribe, like this video, and all that other bullshit. If you'll excuse me, I think I'm gonna go play some Halo now. Goodbye. But what? But empathy is good. In many cases, empathy is good. I'm gonna pull a Trent Reznor and start smashing this mic against my head. You ever seen that? It's f***ing wild. He's like, between singing, he goes, pah! Smacks that shit against his forehead. Are you recording me? Oh, that's awesome, thank you. That's true, it's applicable.